Hey Indian Creek 8th grade students, this is Professor Blazek and I'm here today with part 3 in our video series on the American Civil War titled Civil War Begins. Now the guiding question that I would like you to keep in mind as you watch this video is, what were the main strengths and weaknesses of both sides at the start of the Civil War? Now one key aspect early on in the Civil War were the border states, and the border states were 4 states that allowed slavery but had actually remained in the Union. They had not seceded and become part of the Confederate States of America like all of the other slaveholding states. These 4 states were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware. Now that brings us to our first key term of this video, which is border states. And as I just talked about, border states were slave states that had remained in the Union and were highly coveted by both sides in the Civil War. Obviously, both sides were looking to control as much land and have as many citizens as possible, but if these states had chosen to secede along with the other slaveholding states, this would have been disastrous for the Union. Now, as I just mentioned, secession by these 4 border states would add to Southern power, in addition to the fact that it would mean more land and more people who were part of the Confederate States of America. These states were also important because Missouri controlled much of the Mississippi River, which, as you all know, is the largest river in the United States and a major waterway that can transport both men and materials in fighting a war. Kentucky controlled the Ohio River, another very important waterway, and the northern capital of Washington, D.C. was in Maryland. So these were all reasons, in addition to the fact that the Union just didn't want to lose land, that losing any of these border states would be detrimental to the Union cause. Now, luckily for the Union, all 4 border states would ultimately remain in the Union. There were some times that there was concern that these states would secede, but overall none of them would choose to leave the Union and join the Confederacy. Now you can see here on the map we have the Union states colored in blue, obviously the northern part of the country, as well as California and Oregon. Then we have the Confederate states colored in red, and then our 4 border states there are colored in yellow. So you can see that they almost draw a complete line across the country between the Union and the Confederacy, again just emphasizing how important they were to both sides. Now, early on in the war, the South did actually experience a loss in regards to land because while Virginia had seceded from the Union, there were many people in Virginia who actually opposed secession and wanted to remain a part of the United States. And in 1861, 48 counties in northern Virginia broke away into a separate state called West Virginia and rejoined the Union. If you think back and if you want to pause and go back and look at that map, you'll see that Virginia does not look anything like it does today in that map. That was because the state of West Virginia had not been created yet, but in 1861 it was by these counties of Virginians who opposed secession and wanted to return to the Union. So this was an important victory for the North, again just getting as many people and as much land on its side as possible, as well as obviously being a loss for the Confederacy. Now let's talk about the similarities and differences and really the strengths and weaknesses of both the North and the South at the start of the Civil War. So in the South, important advantages that the South had was that the war was widely supported. Obviously, the people in the South were looking to gain recognition as an independent country and have their way of life preserved. Because The victory in the Civil War by the North would mean that they would actually have to invade and fight in the southern area of the country. This meant that the South would be fighting in familiar territory. They were defending their homeland. The South also had much stronger military leadership, and as you'll see as we talk about some of the battles, this really made an impact early on in the war because most of the really effective generals fought for the South. And the South was also hoping for support from Great Britain and France, and this was because Great Britain and France imported a large amount of cotton from the South. The South was hoping that this trade and, this economic impact that they had in these European countries would lead them to giving the South support in the Civil War, much like France had come to the aid of the United States in the Revolutionary War. Now, some disadvantages for the South were that the South had a much smaller population than the North, and the economy of the South was not nearly as advanced. So there was much less industry, which meant that manufacturing materials that were needed for the war took a lot more time in the South. There was also a lot less coverage in terms of railroads across the South. This just made transportation much more challenging in the South as well. In addition, the states in the Confederacy did not give the Confederate government very much power. There was some infighting, and each state really sort of just looked out for itself before it looked out for the Confederacy as a whole, and this would limit the amount of impact that the Confederate government could have. Now, if we look at the North had a much larger population than the South. As we just talked about, they also had more industry and resources, as well as a better banking system, so they were better prepared to finance and pay for the war, and a larger railroad network. And another aspect that we will see had a great amount of influence in helping the North was that their navy was much stronger, and they had a better leader at the top of their government in Abraham Lincoln than the South did in their president, whose name was Jefferson Davis. Now, the two issues for the North we kind of touched on earlier were that they had to fight in the South to win, so this meant a lot more traveling. They were fighting in unfamiliar territory, and the Southerners were very dedicated to the war and trying to protect their way of life. So it was not going to be easy for the North to just win a few battles and break the Southern spirit, because Southerners were really, really behind the war when it began. Now, both sides of the war also had very different strategies when fighting began, and the North's original goal was first and foremost to bring the South back into the Union, and looking to abolish slavery was not nearly as big of an issue as saving the Union. And you might recall back to the earlier video where we talked about President Lincoln, when he was running, had said that he first and foremost wanted to save the Union. He was not going to fight removing slavery in territories that had already existed, because just keeping the country whole was the #1 goal in the North. Now, the South, on the opposite side, aimed to be recognized as an independent nation, and as we touched on earlier, also hoped for support from Great Britain and France. And these were really, this was their main fallback plan as to how they thought they could win recognition as an independent nation. They were not interested in compromise. They had broken away as a way to protect their way of life, and they wanted to be completely separate from the Union states. So these were obviously two very different strategies at the start of the war. Now, in order for the North to meet their goals, they had three main components of their military strategy. The first was to blockade southern ports, which means to prevent items from coming in and out. This would really damage the Southern economy because so much of it was based upon exporting cotton and importing other resources. And as we talked about, the North had a much stronger navy, so this seemed a very achievable goal. The North also aimed to control the Mississippi River because, as we talked about, it was a very important waterway. This would make transportation much easier. And by controlling the Mississippi River, they would also be able to work into the South from the western side as opposed to simply only attacking from the north. And then their final military component of strategy was to capture Richmond, Virginia, which was the Confederate capital city. Now, on the other side, the South was aiming to fight in a primarily defensive way. They were not looking to invade the North and gain new lands. They just wanted to keep as much land as possible until the North got tired of fighting, until they had lost enough men that the North decided, we are going to give in and we are going to allow the Confederate States to remain a separate country. So again, two very different strategies as regarding military tactics. Now, a very unique aspect of the Civil War, as opposed to really all other wars that were fought in the United States, was that it was American versus American. And because of this, the Civil War would divide families and neighbors if there were certain members who supported the Confederacy versus supported the Union, were pro-slavery versus anti-slavery, and this just caused a large amount of tension within individual families and communities in addition to the country as a whole. Also, many of the officers who were commanding troops in the Civil War had once served alongside the men that they were now fighting against. So again, this just was very different to any other military conflict that the country had seen or would see in its history. And by the summer of 1861, 112,000 troops had enlisted in the Confederate Army, who were often called the rebels, while the Union Army, or the Yankees, had about 187,000 troops already enlisted. So pretty big numbers considering that secession had really only happened about 6 months earlier. You know, there were a lot of people who went out and enlisted very quickly to fight this war because that's how important the goals were for both sides, either saving the Union or the Confederacy being allowed to break apart into its own separate country. So we are here now with the guiding question to end this video. You can look at it one more time, review it if you would like, but that's all we have for part 3 in our series on the American Civil War. I will be back soon with part 4, and until then, this has been Professor Blazek, and I will see you next time.